Hello and welcome to this presentation, Instructional Design and Overview. In the next few slides, I hope to give you a brief overview of instructional design and what exactly that is. The purpose of this presentation is twofold. It is to give you a brief overview of the field or practice of instructional design, but also to briefly describe the various instructional design models. This section of the presentation discusses the field of instructional design. In addition to being a field of research, it's also a profession. Many people work as instructional designers in corporations, academia, and government, and make good money, I might add. Maybe some of you are instructional designers. This field is growing and instructional designers are in high demand because of their varied skills and abilities. Like graphic designers, instructional designers design and develop products. However, rather than only working with graphics, instructional designers work with all sorts of instructional materials, including graphics. In essence, their role is to organize information and people so that others can learn from their efforts. Instructional designers are not always the instructor of what they produce. This is what separates them from the teaching profession. They are there to see that the instruction is well organized and structured for others. So they may be asked to design products in fields with which they have no prior knowledge. To help overcome this barrier of not having that prior knowledge, instructional designers typically work with subject matter experts, or SMEs. This is usually pronounced SME in the field. A SME may be an expert in their field, but does not have experience to teach others. Many people believe they can teach, but instructional designers have spent years studying learning theory and how to present material. So an instructional designer's role is to act as an instructional design expert, and they are tasked with helping clients produce instructional materials. Designing and developing instruction is not the only possibility, though. The role of the instructional designer really is to be a problem solver. Sometimes instructional designers serve as consultants for an organization, and the instructional designer may be called in to help solve a problem and find out what the organization needs. This is called needs assessment, and we'll discuss that in another presentation. But here is an example that illustrates its purpose. Perhaps this instructional designer is asked to work for a regional bank, and their CEO has found out their human resources department is not using the web-based financial software. In this case, the company has hired the instructional designer to solve a problem. Perhaps the CEO thought, we'll just teach them how to use the software. But in this case, the instructional designer was asked to solve a problem concerning a specific audience, the human resources group, about a new subject matter, the web-based financial system. When the instructional designer interviews the human resources team, to her surprise, she finds out they already know how to use the web-based system, and they actually help design the system. And their issue is that they are concerned about the system and the time that it takes to update the online database. So they have been using the desktop environment all along instead, and in this case, it's just that training is not the problem as the CEO thought, but something a little different. It's this type of real-world, authentic problem solving that happens every day and is the job of the instructional designer to solve. And it's this dynamic field in which we're about to discuss in this presentation and the series that follow. So yes, instructional systems design, or ISD, or as it's commonly referred to, instructional design, is a profession, but also a problem-solving process. Instructional designers conduct what is called a needs assessment. That is, they consider the needs of the client, but investigate the system within which those needs exist. The client is usually a subject matter expert or a SME, and sometimes the needs and wants of the client are not always the same thing. Needs and wants can differ. But more importantly, they offer the proper solution. That is, the instructional designer seeks out what is the correct solution to the problem, not just provides instruction. Now let's turn to instructional design theory and consider the theoretical models that support the instructional design process. Let's start with ADDIE. The ADDIE model is the simplest way of thinking about instructional design. ADDIE is an acronym for analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. This is the generalized model for describing the steps of the instructional design process and the steps that that instructional designer might take during the design of instruction. Because it's an acronym, some people think this is a linear stepwise process, and on some level it may be thought of that way, but really and truly, let's think about it a second. As a linear process, an instructional designer would, yes, analyze the problem, design, develop, and implement a solution, later to follow up with an evaluation. While this is a way to think about it, it's really an oversimplification. In reality, the instructional designer may analyze the situation, evaluate the results, discuss those results with others, then do some more analysis, to then reanalyze the same problem a different way, eventually to design some instruction, evaluate that instruction, design and redesign it again, etc., etc. So as you can see, it is not really a simple linear process and is much more complicated than a linear ADD, IE, or ADDIE. But ADDIE is often helpful to describe the parts of the process as analysis or design, development, etc. Also, as I said, this is a generalized instructional design model, and there may be many, many models out there. That's sort of the point of this discussion, that ADDIE is a generalized set of boxes, if you will, and we'll take a look at more design models. Here is the Hanifin and Peck design model. Notice this model has a lot of commonalities with the ADDIE model. Phase 1 is needs assessment. This is similar in many ways to analysis of the ADDIE model. The rest of the phases are identical to the ADDIE model, and this model assumes evaluation and revision happen throughout the design process. Here's the Kemp design model. This is a much more complex model and goes well beyond the ADDIE model. At first glance, it may seem a bit complex, but does include many of the processes common in the instructional design process. Processes like task analysis or learner characteristics are very important. Finally, this is the Dick and Carey model, and it's the most well-known and cited instructional design model. At first glance, this model seems almost linear, but notice that it has some twists and turns in it. In particular, notice the differences between the dotted lines and the solid lines. The dotted lines allow for revision in the instruction at any point. Like the ADDIE model slide shown a little earlier, This model allows for revision and return to earlier phases in the process. Now, to really be able to use these models, you would have to concentrate on each of the steps involved. And we'll do that in more detail, and perhaps in other presentations you'll see more about each of these steps. But take a moment, pause this presentation, and consider each of the boxes and ponder what might happen at each of these steps in the process. Okay, this concludes this presentation. It was developed as a very brief overview of instructional design. In this presentation, we discussed the role of an instructional designer in his or her organization. In addition, this presentation presented several instructional design models. It should not be expected that you'll be able to use these models after viewing these graphics once, just that you would be aware that there are several instructional design models. In particular, this presentation highlighted the Dick and Carey model because it's really the standard by which most instructional design models are considered. There will be several such presentations available from this website. Please take the time to review them. Thank you and goodbye.